one of the key features of at least the first decade of reform was that after Deng Xiaoping and the Reform Coalition, he had, in order to oust Hua Guofeng, the transitional leader between Mao and Deng, various factions came together and formed a coalition, a reform coalition. But once Deng had consolidated power after the 11th plenum in December of 1978, the reform faction itself kind of split into two broad factions again. And this resulted in almost annual cycles of reform and retrenchment. In fact, there was a theory among Chinese economists that on even years, the Chinese economic policy would open up. So like 1978 was the third plenum, 1980 the 4 special economic zones were open, 1982 the household responsibility system was implemented, plus the collectivization, 1984 started industrial reform. But then on the odd years, and this is just a theory, I mean, I don't think it actually maps out quite that neatly, but there was a crackdown on the democracy wall movement in '79. There were various campaigns against spiritual pollution and bourgeois liberalization in the other odd years of the 80s. The Tiananmen Square crisis in 1989, which was precipitated by widespread disenchantment with inflation and corruption, was on an odd year. And then after a 3-year freeze on reform, when Deng visited the southern coastal provinces in 1992, that kind of signaled a renewed commitment to continued economic liberalization. So this is important because it shows that there was no overarching plan or blueprint when China started its reform era in 1978. There was no idea what was going to be on the other side. So a slogan that you'll see cited a lot in newspapers and popular writings is their strategy was to cross the river by groping for stones. Like they didn't know how they were going to get to the other side. They didn't even know if there was going to be another side. Their whole approach towards reform was very experimental and gradual and uncertain. So certain years there would be liberalization and then they would retrench and try again. And so it was kind of 1 step forward, 2 steps back, a lot of internal debate over how effective things were working, a lot of kind of responsive reforms, and also very experimental, meaning that certain types of reforms would be tried in just a select couple of locations, or pilot locality, and see how that went before letting it spread to the rest of the country. This is a very different way of conducting economic policy or reforming a socialist system. No other socialist system has been reformed in quite the same incremental and experimental way as in China. So the first thing that occurred in rural areas, it didn't happen immediately, but it had very important implications, which is administrative reorganization. As of 1978, rural China was still organized according to communes and production brigades, and so there weren't any local governments. Like if you said what was local government, there's no local government, it was called a commune. So there was a new constitution, there was a constitutional revision in 1982 that then converted the communes into actual township level governments. So the township level of government was reintroduced, reinstalled. And then production brigades were turned into village governments. And households were no longer, expected to work together on production teams. So this was more than just a discursive change. I mean, it's not just renaming, it was actual revitalization of governmental levels of governments in rural China. In a way, this was kind of after the fact, because even after the Great Leap Forward, certain functions that communes were providing, like communal mess halls and communal daycare centers, had already been dismantled. But they were still, there still required some shifting around in personnel, as people who were working for communes were now reclassified as working for governments. Second was decollectivization of agriculture. Remember how I explained how production teams turn into lower agricultural cooperatives and then higher level ones and collectives. Well, that whole structure was dismantled. Originally, this was only intended to happen in backward areas, like very impoverished mountainous regions and also minority areas. The initial plan was just, let's just start with those most destitute areas. But it spread, decollectivization ended up spreading really rapidly to the rest of rural China between 1981 and 84. And this was replaced, the collectives were replaced by something called the household responsibility system. Sometimes people also call it the contracting system. And that just meant that the farmers would, in effect, be renting their land from their production team or brigade, or I guess township government, to engage in private production. And this had started gradually a little bit after the Great Leap Forward already, but it spread much more, but it was criticized by Mao as well as Liu Shaoqi, so it sort of halted. But with decollectivization, the household responsibility system basically replaced the former form of agricultural production. And this was sanctioned from above. So there was like a formal document in 82 saying that the household responsibility system is consistent with socialism. Another thing that happens throughout the reform eras, every single time there's a new reform, there's some ideological justification or banner coined to basically rationalize it as being consistent with socialism. They don't want to be seen as departing from socialist ideology, so it has to be justified every time. And after that announcement, literally within a year, nearly 3/4 of production teams were now engaging in household contracting, and that just household contracting just meant that you would sign an agreement or a contract with a local government saying, I will every year deliver this amount of grain. And then after they deliver that grain, if they produce more than that, then they could keep that and they could resell it. They could do whatever they wanted. So this proved to be very, this incentivized agricultural production a lot more than the communes did. The second major change, which was important for agricultural growth, was finally there was an increase in the procurement prices, the prices that the government would pay farmers for purchasing grain. And so you can imagine that further incentivized farmers to produce more grain. And then they could keep they could keep the residual. So only part of their harvest was contracted. It wasn't like they had to hand everything over. And due to the combination of decollectivization as well as the increase in procurement prices, output doubled between 1978 and 1984. These reforms were tremendously successful in bolstering not just agricultural output, but also household savings. And this is really key because now that farmers were finally starting to accumulate some surplus, it went straight into the banking system. And once it was in the banking system, then the banking system later on, or simultaneously, ended up funneling it towards the industrial sector for investment. So in a way, farmers continued to subsidize industrialization, but just it was being done through the financial system instead. Another result of these reforms was the emergence of a massive pool of rural surplus labor. Once farmers were allowed to leave the collectives, that freed them up to engage in non-agricultural activities, and these reforms ended up creating a pool of approximately 200 million rural residents that started wandering into the cities to seek employment or started working in rural industry. It expanded the pool of wage labor for China, basically. And then this also encouraged diversification of production. So rather than just trying to fill the quota, well, they would fill the quota, but then anything beyond the quota, farmers planted a greater diversity of crops or started engaging in what were called domestic sidelines, like handicrafts or some petty trading, that sort of thing. So the rural economy became much more vibrant in a remarkably short period of time. This happened really quickly. Fiscal decentralization, I will talk about this a lot more later, but this was also a key reform that incentivized rural growth, particularly in the form of what were called township and village enterprises. These were as they sound like. These were small factories that were run by township and village governments. And this gave rise to what became known as the collective sector. So when you hear the term state sector, that means these are state-owned enterprises are owned by the state, like the central state or the provincial level of government. Actually, some local governments also own state-owned enterprises. But the collective sector, it's kind of a step down. It's not considered private because these aren't individual entrepreneurs, at least not in the early stage. But they're run by local governments, local rural governments, and so they're seen as more collective, for lack of a better word, but not as formal and beholden to the state as state-owned enterprises, if that makes sense. But the combination of the state sector plus the collective sector constitutes the public sector in China's economy. Okay. And then the private sector would be foreign invested enterprises and genuinely private enterprises. Rural industrialization rapid rural industrialization represent the major puzzle for economists to explain by the end of the 90s in China. So there was a whole proliferation of studies saying how did China's rural miracle occur? After all these efforts during the Mao era to promote, to narrow the gap between rural and urban areas, to foster rural industrialization, why did it finally work this time? The political story or explanation is that Deng's Reform Coalition was able to push through these rural reforms because they did not threaten the immediate interests of the oppositional faction. The other faction was the heavy industry faction, the petroleum, that represented the interests of petroleum, steel, petrochemicals, etc. And so the idea is that, well, because this was not a zero-sum proposition. This was just creating winners without hurting vested interests. That made it politically feasible. Another political explanation is that after Deng consolidated power, the first thing the reformers did was rehabilitate the tens of thousands, actually hundreds of thousands of cadres that had been sent to the countryside during the Cultural Revolution to work on farms and in factories. They brought them back to Beijing. They brought them back into the government, and they put them on the Central Committee of the Communist Party. And by stacking the Central Committee with all these people who had suffered during the Cultural Revolution, that created an immediate coalition of pro-reform people. Because these were people who had just spent a decade, or lost a decade of their lives, kind of interrupted, and were very, very reluctant to pursue Mao-era type policies. They were pro-reform. And then the third political explanation, which is quite interesting, in some of the academic literature, you may see accounts of decollectivization as having occurred from the farmers spontaneously by below. That the farmers just said, okay, we've had it. We are not going to work on collectives anymore. We're going to reclaim the land and just do household farming. This is what we want. And it's often framed as like the power of the farmers, the power of the people, reform from below. And this explanation is what Beijing and the reformers used to justify acceleration of decollectivization. They said, oh, the farmers want it. The farmers are demanding it. And that's how they had to frame it, because otherwise there would have been political opposition to overturning Mao-era institutions so dramatically. And as an example of this, in many cases, farmers were not, local governments, they were kind of sluggish in decollectivization. They weren't going to do it on their own. It wasn't until it came from the top down that, oh, no, the farmers want it. You have to dismantle these collectives. Then the local officials were basically kind of coerced into it. So I think it's important to understand that actually this reform is much more top down than some people, than official accounts claim it to be. Right? It wasn't like the farmers all got together and then this was a second revolution or counter-revolution against the collectives. It was actually a top-down decision that decollectivization would occur, and that's why it happened so quickly. And there are a variety of economic explanations for the rapidity of rural industrialization as well. First, I mean, it was a permissive policy environment. The growth of rural industry had started in the Mao era already incrementally. During the 1970s, rural industry was permitted in what they call the 5 small industries of iron and steel, cement, chemical, fertilizer, hydroelectric power, and farm implements. And those 5 rural industries were permitted because they were seen as being important for socialist industrial development. Second, another reason that rural industry took off so fast was because, and was profitable, was because rural labor is so much cheaper than urban labor. So, and also township and village enterprises didn't have as much access to credit from the state banking system than state-owned enterprises. So they were able to, use low-cost inputs, labor, and they were able to sell their outputs at market prices. So that relates to the third point, which is they had very, very high profit margins. And they were able to compete more effectively with state-owned enterprises that had never been held to market competition, and they never had any incentive to. And rural industries also emerged in completely new industries, like consumer-oriented industries, light industries, consumer products, toys, plastics, garments, shoes, that sort of thing. And meanwhile, township and village enterprises also had much lower taxes to hand over to the state than SOEs. They were given a 3-year tax holiday in 1978, and then they said once they started to generate profits, then there would be a flat tax of 20% on profits, any profit above 3,000 RMB. I mean, this changed later on, but initially there were fiscal incentives for rural industry. There was also preferential access to capital. Even though state-owned enterprises got more capital, local financial institutions were kind of beholden to the local governments, local township and village governments, so they were more inclined to provide subsidized loans to township and village enterprises. And then finally, these clusters of township and village enterprises tended to emerge on the peripheries of urban areas, and they grew into regional clusters. So like in Jiangsu province, especially along the eastern coast of China, Jiangsu, Zhejiang, and Shandong, they all kind of, they grew in a kind of a clustered manner around urban centers. So urban firms would subcontract to these township and village enterprises for production. And so there was a kind of a natural ecosystem that started to emerge in these eastern provinces. By the mid-1980s, about 60, well, depending on the province, 60 to 90% of township village enterprises had direct subcontracting relationships with urban firms. So that was very helpful in creating a demand for their products. Now, a more kind of political economy explanation would be, is driven by the puzzle of how was rural industry able to take off so rapidly in the absence of secure property rights, in the absence of privatization, right? Rural growth in China defies conventional explanations of neoclassical explanations of growth, because at least this is the way that some political economists have framed it. So they say, well, actually, even in China's case shows that even if you don't have a completely capitalist economy, it's still possible to grow quickly if the incentive mechanisms are aligned. And so the incentives that created, what incentivized local governments to really promote local growth were 2 big reforms. One was decollectivization. What decollectivization did was it eliminated agriculture as the primary source of village income. And once villages no longer had access to agricultural, to the grain quota, this created a real fiscal crisis among local governments. Suddenly they didn't have a source of revenue. Combined with fiscal decentralization meant that now the central government was no longer going to bail out local governments. Local governments were expected to be self-financed and had to identify new revenue sources. So this then created a real vested interest on the part of local governments to support rural industry by whatever means possible. So they started competing with one another for foreign direct investment. They would offer foreign investors, especially in Guangdong and Fujian province, preferential treatment, tax-free, cheap labor, no concerns about pollution, producing, manufacturing at that time in the early years of reform. And the key here is that with fiscal decentralization, once local governments handed over their what they owed the higher governments, they were allowed to keep the residual. This is really key. They could keep the residual, so then that not only benefits local governments, but local government officials, etc. I mean, it was all, everything was aligned in a way that local governments had very, very strong vested interest in promoting rural industrialization. Very different from the kind of more top-down command approach to commanding agricultural output during the Great Leap Forward, for example. So China went through an incredible rural industrial, it industrialized agriculturally in just the span of a decade. But this had, this rapid growth had very destabilizing effects beyond first creating, a floating population of 200 million people in search of work, but without adequate welfare or social safety nets. There were, meanwhile, local governments also were predatory towards farmers and extracting higher fees, because remember, they were hungry for revenue, so they were trying to get revenue through whatever means possible. Sometimes it was from rural industry, from other times it was from squeezing peasants and just coming up with making up all sorts of fees and squeezing them. And this led to rising incidents of farmers' protests throughout rural China. And sometimes the local governments would write like these IOUs to the farmers, but then they wouldn't repay them, and so that would lead to more farmers' protests. Later on, there were illegal land grabs, as well as local governments decided to seize agricultural land for real estate development or other purposes, usually real estate. So this has been extremely destabilizing. There are far more protests during the Reform era than there ever were during the Mao era. I mean, the protests that occurred in the Mao era, they were politically orchestrated. They were the Communist Party's campaigns to root out certain ills in society, or counter-revolutionary ills in society. Whereas the protests and the incidents that we see in the Reform era, these are definitely not being orchestrated by the party. These are genuine expressions of societal discontent. As I mentioned earlier, industrial reform, this was the really hard part. This was the beneficiaries of Mao era development were very, very large state-owned enterprises that employed, 20,000, 50,000, 80,000, even 100,000 employees a pop. Like the Mao era elites, to the extent that there were elites, income inequality was really low, but the privileged strata in the Mao era were managers of state-owned enterprises. They enjoyed the iron rice bowl, right, iron cradle to grave protection. They had housing, they had healthcare, they had food, they had employment, etc. And so to touch those, so reformers avoided unsettling that for a very long time. But when they finally did, they also did it very tentatively. The initial goal was never privatization, and in fact, to date, the term privatization in China is not used because it's still considered really kind of politically sensitive. So they call it restructuring, but in the early stages, they didn't even do restructuring. They just increased enterprise autonomy in terms of setting prices, in terms of reinstating bonuses, allowing a greater profit retention at the enterprise level, so that enterprises like farmers would be motivated to maximize their output, because once they filled the quota, then they could keep anything that was above quota. So that was the first. It was never about privatization at the outset. They also implemented a factory director responsibility system, which was meant to give technocrats and enterprise managers more authority over the enterprise, because during the Cultural Revolution, the managers of SOEs weren't the people who were the most competent, but rather the people that were the most politically loyal. So this changed during the Reform era. They're like, okay, let's put in people who actually know something about how to run a factory. And they started to disengage the party committee from the production decisions of the state-owned enterprises. I mean, all state-owned enterprises and all public units have a party branch, for sure, but they're kind of cordoned off to the side rather than making the most important production and investment decisions of an enterprise. And this did kind of this wasn't very easy to do immediately, but since the party was still granted autonomy to do their kind of political thought work on the side, they weren't eliminated. They were just sort of cordoned off. So it was still possible to do that and reinstate some rationality into the management of factories. There was also price reform, and this had very negative consequences for state-owned enterprises' profitability, because price reform hit the sectors that had been the most powerful during the Mao era. Before, the inputs for state-owned enterprises were all subsidized. So, and this ended up creating all sorts of irrational production decisions. For example, coal prices during the Mao era were artificially depressed. So it was really cheap to get coal. And this created perverse incentives for factories to use more coal, since the price of steel, which was was inflated. It then made steel mills look much more profitable than they actually were. Now, if steel mills had to pay what a market price for coal would have been, then their profit margins would have been much thinner. So price reform, trying to align the price of inputs and outputs with actual market supply and demand, eroded the profits of state-owned enterprises. There were also efforts to implement a bankruptcy law in the 90s, but this was never truly implemented. They were trying to subject state-owned enterprises to what are called hard budget constraints, meaning like if you don't generate enough revenue and you go bankrupt, then you go bankrupt and then you close your doors and that's it. Lay off the workers and the assets get sold. And this wasn't really happening in the 90s. There were some efforts to do that, but instead what happened was every time a state-owned enterprise started to get into trouble, they would just get more and more loans from the state banking system. And this had, this was not good for the balance sheets of state-owned enterprises. And also state-owned enterprises would borrow from one another, so these were called inter-enterprise liabilities, so they started to accumulate a lot of these. And state-owned enterprises also started to face some challenges in financing their pension liabilities. So all these problems were kind of accumulating, but they weren't truly dealing with them in the early stage. And what we see is in the 1980s, as the economy was heating up, it had real inflationary effects, so that the prices of certain goods were going up, but the wages were not going up at the same level, because workers' wages had been frozen for the entire Mao era, and they just weren't keeping up with the increased prices in food and consumer goods. And so a lot of the frustration that led to the political crisis of 1989 was economic in origin. It wasn't just, sometimes Western media portrays it as a democracy movement. I mean, there was a political component to it, but the initial grievances that led people, especially workers, to participate in the protests were based on material concerns and also concern about corruption. One thing that a lot of people don't realize is during the early reform era, state sector employment actually grew. The state sector actually expanded during the initial, actually expanded by nearly 40 million workers between 1993 and 1997. So even though this was the reform era, do you have a question? One more thing? Yeah, between 1993 and 1997, this was a period where in theory, they should have been implementing the bankruptcy law of 1996, but they weren't implementing the bankruptcy law. Instead, they were actually hiring more workers. So state sector employment increased by nearly 40 million workers, from 72 million to 110 million. So this was not in keeping with marketization, certainly. That wasn't going in the right direction from a market-oriented perspective, and it was also burdening the banking system. So it wasn't. So by the late 1990s, China's state-owned commercial banks were really suffering. They had very high levels of non-performing loans, and economists like Nicholas Lardy were talking about how the banks in China were essentially insolvent, and this was getting to be a real this could be a real crisis for the financial system. So in 1997, at the 15th Party Congress, was when the party finally took the really hard decision to announce mass restructuring, really privatization, but mass restructuring of all but the largest 100 centrally held state-owned enterprises. So all the small and medium SOEs at the local level were merged, restructured, sold off to their managers, etc. So this was the most kind of dramatic move. But this is really 2 decades into the reform era, right? You see how that was delayed. Oh, okay. So I've already talked about some of the state sector challenges. These are some of the reasons why there was such pressure to undertake restructuring by the end of the 1990s. Part of the problem too was that because SOEs weren't profitable, they also weren't paying taxes, and so this had an adverse impact on central government revenues. They're like, we've got a problem. We're not, we're unable to collect taxes from our nearly bankrupt SOEs, so we've got to restructure them. So then you might ask, well, how was growth even occurring under these circumstances? Well, capital accumulation was basically fueled by household savings, and mainly rural household savings. And to date, household savings remains very high in China. It's unusually high. And, well, I'll talk about one of the biggest paradoxes, I think, of the first couple of decades of reform is, how is it that the most productive sector of the economy, the private sector, grew so rapidly? It went from basically non-existent in 1978 to over 30 million private businesses by the end of the 1990s. How did that occur? Private enterprises were completely excluded from state-owned commercial banks. Well, there are a couple of, this is actually the topic of my first book, which is old now, but when I first was doing my research in the mid-1990s, I went around and I surveyed private entrepreneurs to find out, well, okay, so how are you raising money? Where's your money coming from? And basically, I learned that most of them relied on informal finance. Not just borrowing from friends and family, but also really creative forms of financial institutions, such as rotating, well, ROSCAs, I guess here they're called chip funds. But then there were also, like, banks, private banks that were disguised as magazine reading clubs, and there were all sorts of creative ways of financing the private sector in ways that were quasi-legal rather than completely illegal or underground. And one of the more popular ways of financing private enterprises was actually to falsely register as a collective enterprise. And this strategy was called wearing a red hat. That meant, I'm a private entrepreneur and I really want to get all the favorable treatment that collective enterprises are getting. Because collective enterprises don't have to pay taxes, they get land for their factories, they get access to credit from state banks and credit cooperatives. So what do? Well, I'll just go buy myself a registration status as a collective enterprise. And this means local officials were totally complicit in this. They're like, fine, so they're selling these like collective enterprise registration statuses. So I found in some of the localities that I was doing research that up to 95% of de facto totally private enterprises were just falsely registered as collective enterprises. So in that way, they were able to get some bank loans as well. They weren't just relying on informal finance. And this was like a very publicly known fact. This is not, in China, everyone knew that many collective enterprises, what started out as genuine collective enterprises, by the end, many of them were actually red hat enterprises. They were just private enterprises. So there's a whole scale. The first generation of petty entrepreneurs were mainly underemployed farmers who were kind of peddling on the side, doing services or petty trade. But over time, Communist Party members and political elites started engaging in private enterprise as well. And this was completely illegal because after 1989, the Communist Party explicitly said that party members should not be engaged in capitalist activities. And yet, by 2000, 20% of the entire Chinese Communist Party was running a business of some sort. And this became very difficult to kind of justify ideologically. It became increasingly difficult to justify.
And the same person?
Yes.
The same person?
Absolutely. But actually, this one was diversified. He actually started out in manufacturing, and then once he built up a couple of factories, then started acquiring real estate. Yeah. But in order to, but this total party member, really well connected, very different from the guy who fixes bicycles on the street, right? So what we see here is something that was very unintended by the reformers. So let me reframe the story again. So we've got agricultural decollectivization. It frees farmers to engage in petty trade, right? And then some decide that they want to run larger scale enterprises. But it was illegal to hire more than 8 employees in the 80s. And the reason for this is because according to Marx's Das Kapital, any production unit that hired more than 8 employees was considered an exploitative capitalist producer, whereas if you had less than 8 employees, then you're just like a household producing unit, which is okay. So when businesses wanted to hire more than 8 employees, they falsely registered themselves as collectives. So those were also red hat enterprises. So that's kind of a 1980s phenomenon. By the 90s, there are more and more party members also getting into business. And so the party, by the end of the 90s and early 2000s, really faced an issue. Were they going to continue to pretend that the party does not allow private enterprise, or were they going to sanction it? And they decided to sanction it. And by 2001, which was the Communist Party's 80th anniversary, this is when Jiang Zemin was General Secretary, he formally invited private entrepreneurs to join the party, and the party started aggressively recruiting private entrepreneurs to join the party. They kind of realized that if they kept excluding the most profitable part of society and the economy, that would weaken the party. So the party decided to co-opt private entrepreneurs, and the ideological justification for that was Jiang Zemin's so-called theory of the 3 represents. And his theory of the 3 represents was that the party should represent the most advanced productive forces, the most advanced cultural forces, and the third advance doesn't translate very well into English, but pursue practices that represent the widest swath of society. That one doesn't represent, that doesn't translate well, but anyway, that 3 represents was just used to justify recruitment of capitalists into the Communist Party. And then finally, we see in 2004, the PRC Constitution, state constitution, was officially revised to protect private property rights. So this is a complete reversal of the PRC's founding principles and of the Communist Party's founding principles. And it was able to do this because it happened so gradually. I mean, if you had told the reformers on December of 1978 that this was going to happen by 2004, unimaginable, completely unthinkable. But it was very incremental, and it was covered up in very kind of creative ways. And the fact is that members of the party themselves saw that it was beneficial to economic growth, to themselves, to their own welfare. One thing that I think is really important to point out when talking about China's economy in general, but also when teaching the reform era, is the reality of local variation and local development models. The media tends to talk about China this, China that, and anthropomorphize it and generalize about it. But the fact is that there are really important differences among regions in China. So I don't think there is a single reform era model of development, but rather I think we need to acknowledge that regions have developed very, very differently depending on where they are and sort of their legacies from the Mao era. So the South China model, for example, this is the coastal cities and areas in Guangdong province and Fujian were early beneficiaries of special economic zones, and they were allowed to attract foreign direct investment earlier than other parts of the country. And so they got massive inflows of foreign direct investment, mainly from overseas Chinese that were based in Hong Kong and Taiwan, and then also some in Southeast Asia. And this really fueled this kind of diasporic or ethnic foreign direct investment, really financed the manufacturing miracle of South China. And their model development in the early reform era has been export-oriented manufacturing, labor-intensive manufacturing, and predominantly financed by overseas Chinese and kind of funneled through Hong Kong. By contrast, what's known as the Sunan model, Sunan stands for Southern Jiangsu, that is the model of rural industrialization based on the collective sector. Because Sunan, Southern Jiangsu, always had a stronger legacy of communes. Their communes were larger, they were redder, they were more, they were just more closely aligned with the party and the party's mandates all along. And so they had, they didn't receive much foreign direct investment during the reform era. They didn't have much of a private sector. They were very collective sector oriented in terms of growth. Then what's known as the Wenzhou model. Wenzhou is in Zhejiang province, which is also in the coastal south, is much more private sector dominated. Places like Zhejiang and many sections of Fujian province, they were intentionally deprived of capital investment during the state sector. So they were extremely impoverished. And they also didn't have very strong collective sectors during the Mao era. So when reform started, local governments just sort of quietly allowed their farmers to start, running private factories, registering them as red hat enterprises, trading, etc. And in those areas, the policy environment for being a private entrepreneur is much, much better than, let's say, trying to be a private entrepreneur in a northeast or central province that was dominated by state-owned enterprises. So they're really different realities. I mean, if someone asks me, is it easy to do business in China? I mean, my answer would have to be, well, what kind of business, right? I mean, are you a foreign investor? Are you ethnic Chinese? Are you planning to do a joint venture with a state-owned enterprise? Is this completely private, right? The conditions, local operating conditions are very different. And then there are remote mountainous areas that have experienced depopulation. So this is a summary of what we see over the course of both the socialist Mao era as well as the reform era. So you see how between 1950 and 1978, the state sector grew tremendously. It contributed to 78% of industrial output by the beginning of the reform era. But this declines by the time we get to the eve of the global financial crisis in 2008. It had declined to 15%. The collective sector goes through a bit of a boom during the 90s, but then diminishes. The collective sector, ultimately, of township and village enterprises, ultimately ended up being privatized as well. Over time, genuinely collective enterprises also started to run into all sorts of inefficiencies and declining profitability, so they were privatized as well, or restructured rather. And then you see the private sector. Remember, after the first 3 years of recovery, when the communists first took power from 1949 to 1951, the private sector still existed during those first 3 years. By the end of the reform era, it did not, and then it reemerged and really boomed. The foreign sector, foreigners were all kicked out of, or foreign capital was all kicked out of China at the time of PRC's establishment and wasn't allowed in again until the reform era, so you can see that distribution as well. In terms of contribution to GDP by sector, we see that agriculture declines, sorry about that hanging percentage mark, I forgot to delete that, from 58% all the way down to 8%. You see industry, kind of China industrialized between 52 and 78 for sure, and it continued to grow, but now there's been a real structural shift towards services. Remember the financial problems I was talking about with non-performing loans and the state banking system? Well, thanks to China's massive trade surplus and therefore large accumulation of foreign exchange reserves and creation of a sovereign wealth fund called the China Investment Corporation, which we heard about yesterday, thanks to these assets, China was able to restructure the balance sheets of its insolvent state-owned commercial banks by basically selling off, like literally moving the non-performing loans off their balance sheets onto these asset management companies that investment banks like Morgan Stanley invested in. They invested in the bad debts of China's SOEs. That cleaned up China's state-owned commercial banks' balance sheets, like the Industrial Commercial Bank of China. I'm just reading the acronyms because there are a lot of acronyms here. CCB is China Construction Bank, ABC is Agricultural Bank of China, and BOC is Bank of China. They just literally, they cleaned up their balance sheets, sold off the bad debts, and prepared them for IPOs. And now they dominate, they're among the world's largest banks through this kind of restructuring. But to date, they still don't lend as much to the private sector as they do to the state sector. So there's still issues here, for sure. Another issue is that China's 3 decades of, rapid, sustained growth has pretty much come to an end. There was a serious dip after the global financial crisis. The regime's response to the global financial crisis was to undertake a massive stimulus package that rivaled the size of the U.S. stimulus package of U.S. $585 billion. And state banks were encouraged to lend, to invest, and this was just to kind of keep the economy from completely tanking. And the stimulus package was effective. There's the stimulus. It was effective in recovering China's growth rates, but this ended up taking the form of overcapacity. A lot of the investment went into infrastructure as well as real estate. And then we see here that the decades of double-digit growth are over. China has entered what they call the new normal of more moderate macroeconomic growth. There's also been considerable instability in the stock market. China's equity markets are not like equity markets in other parts of the world, meaning that most of the Shanghai Stock Exchange, it's dominated by state-owned enterprises rather than private enterprises. And while most equity markets, the players in equity markets in other parts of the world are institutional investors, in China you've got like taxi drivers and everyday people investing in the stock market, often in a highly speculative way. So this creates a fair amount of volatility. This is what resulted from the stimulus. Tremendous, ghost towns because they're empty buildings, excessive production of steel, solar panels, ships, block after block after block of empty and partially constructed buildings are all visible if you go through various parts of China. Meanwhile, the gap, ROA stands for return on assets. There's been a growing gap between the return on assets and profitability of SOEs versus private industrial firms. So you can see that state-owned firms, that's the lowest line, and the light blue line, that's the return on assets of private firms. So there's still a growing gap between private and state sector profitability. Meanwhile, there's been growing income inequality. The Gini coefficient at the eve of reform was 0.17. Now it's more like 0.52 or 0.53, which is about the same level as the United States. It's an extremely rapid growth in inequality and concentration of wealth. I do see Mumbai is up there with 45 billionaires. Do you see that? Between Shenzhen and Hangzhou.
Yeah, Ambani is there.
Who's there?
Ambani.
Oh, okay. But under Xi Jinping, there's been a massive anti-corruption campaign, and let's see, I actually have figures on this about the number of people. Oh yeah, so the campaign was to crack down on tigers, meaning like the really large scale, the super corrupt officials, and 280 tigers at the central level have been brought down. And over 2 million and other party members have been charged with corruption since 2012. So this has been a very serious crackdown, and it's had the impact of making local government officials very reluctant to engage in the kind of creative practices that they had done in the 80s and 90s. I mean, some people say that, you know, they were corrupt in the 80s and 90s, and it's true that they absolutely were, but in a mutually beneficial way, because a lot of the corruption that occurred in the 80s and 90s was because China didn't have the regulatory context for doing certain things. Like, there weren't rules. I mean, it had to form an actual regulatory state, and so greasing the wheels turned out to be mutually beneficial for both local enterprises as well as local officials. But now local officials are terrified of being investigated. So now they don't want to do anything. They're in a stage of paralysis. They don't want to take a chance of being accused of corruption. And there have been major net capital outflows since 2012 when Xi Jinping became the general secretary as well. This has continued. All this is, with the slowdown in economic growth, there's been an effort to come up with other forms of regime legitimacy, not just performance legitimacy, not just rapid economic growth, but also to try to foster a greater sense of pan-China pride and national identity. And so Xi Jinping's, one of his slogans was to cultivate the China dream. And then, as we heard about yesterday, the Belt and Road Initiative is another way of trying to project China's power throughout the world, and also resolve some of the overproduction and overcapacity that it has domestically by going outwards. Okay, I'm able to leave plenty of time for discussion. So just some concluding reflections. The reform era, 4 decades. It has now lasted longer than the now era. And this is something that, when I first started teaching, that wasn't true. But that's been 20 years. So, and yet, so many of the legacies from the Mao era are still with us in terms of state-owned enterprises, in terms of the ideological sensitivity of talking about things like privatization. So the Mao legacy is still very much there. Second, aggregate economic growth has even more significantly improved human development indicators in terms of poverty alleviation, definitely literacy and higher education. There's been tremendous investment into creating world-class research universities in China. Infrastructural development is virtually unparalleled, and international competitiveness has increased significantly as well. But despite this strong performance, China's leadership is still very, very concerned about social stability and maintaining regime durability as it enters a period of more moderate economic growth. It's very sensitive to critique, and China is currently in what I would consider one of the most repressive phases that it's experienced since the Mao era in terms of tolerance for critique and civil societal activities. I welcome your questions.